Okay, I think we're going to get started. So welcome everybody to this evening's virtual event, the Resilient Urban Futures book launch and roundtable. My name is Chris Kennedy. I'm the Assistant Director at the Urban Systems Lab here at the New School. I just want to take a moment to thank you for joining us tonight, and we're going to get our program started shortly. This event is prepared and presented by the Urban Systems Lab at the New School, the Urban Resilience to Extreme Weather Events Sustainability Research Network, the University of California at Berkeley, and the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State University, among other institutions. Special thanks today also to the Tishman Environment and Design Center, who's been helping to organize events like this for their Climate Week NYC event series. So I just recommend checking out their Climate Hub events page online, which will pop into the chat so you can see some other upcoming events happening this week. Just some basic housekeeping rules before we get started here. We will have time for question and answers towards the end of this evening's program. So we just ask that you keep your microphones muted until then, but we highly encourage you to use the chat to put any questions there and also to share resources and connect with folks here in this Zoom space. The session will be recorded and we'll make sure that we send out a link in a few days so that you can share with colleagues and friends. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our speakers for today, and each of them will introduce themselves as they present throughout the evening. So welcome to Zoe Hamstead, who's at the University of California, Berkeley, Marta Berbés-Blázquez at Arizona State University, Elizabeth Cook at Barnard College at Columbia University, and Timon McPhearson at the New School, and David Iwaniec at Georgia State University. Welcome, everybody. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Zoe.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to see all of you here. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, or Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm so excited to be moderating this webinar with my friends in Phoenix and Atlanta and New York. The Resilient Urban Futures volume that we're gonna be able to chat with you about during this webinar is about bringing together diverse types of knowledge, approaches, and places and people in order to address what is arguably our most existential twin, or we might even think of it as a triple threat of climate change, urbanization, and growing social inequality. It involves both a scientific perspective that brings cutting edge knowledge about the global nature of the threat, together with place-based and grounded experiences. So in some sense, the project asks, how can cities learn from each other and be a network of learning and co-production while also honoring place-based and culturally appropriate needs and practices? And we frame the climate disaster not just as an atmospheric condition that we've created, but which of course is also driven by poor infrastructural and institutional adaptation. So the volume that we're going to be talking about is the collective product of 180 researchers from 21 institutions working together with 220 practitioners in 9 cities of the United States and Latin America, working together for about 6 years and counting now. So those cities where this work has taken place include Miami, Florida, Baltimore, Maryland, New York and Syracuse, New York, Portland, Oregon, Phoenix, Arizona, Hermosillo, Mexico, Valdivia, Chile, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. I want to acknowledge the leadership of Nancy Grimm and Chuck Redman at Arizona State University, who are principal investigators on the National Science Foundation funded grant that supported all of the network building and research, including this volume, which came out of the project we call Urban Resilience to Extremes. You might hear it referred to as UREX if we slip up and use an acronym. And by the way, the volume is available for free download, so please grab it if you haven't already. Our work is based on the premise that climate impacts occur across interdependent human, climate, biophysical, engineered systems. So the work involves a kind of rethinking of cities as interconnected social, ecological, technological systems, or sets, which you're going to hear more about shortly. In the context of contemporary urban management, the Western culture construction of the nature-culture dichotomy has really translated to treating nature as an obstacle to overcome or a resource to exploit. We've constructed engineered systems and political governance systems and ecological systems under the premise of that nature-human divide. And so what SETS is hopefully helping us to do in part is to provide a way to understand urban challenges as interactions occurring across those interrelated and interdependent domains. Managing climate threats from the perspective of interdependence, cross and interdisciplinarity, and intersectoral practice, while still respecting the diversity of experience and knowledge that practice and scholarship domains bring, right? The disciplines of ecology, engineering, policy and planning, geography, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we're going to talk through today are some of the tools and approaches that were developed in the process of not just articulating from a scholarly perspective, what is the nature of the urban resilience challenge, but also developing co-creative and actionable, implementable, place-based scenarios to guide futures in resilience practice. Those approaches involve different epistemologies, different types of experience, different levels of co-production and engagement, different levels of data and other resources that are necessary to do this work. So we intend for this volume to be a guide, serve as some pilot and preliminary models for urban communities that want to engage in scenario processes around addressing challenges of urban flooding, heat, drought, and other climate exacerbated weather conditions. Toward the end of this webinar, we're also going to have a chance to talk about where the project landed and where it's going next. The volume has a future orientation. As David and Elizabeth are going to describe in a few moments, it's really about what are the positive possibilities for the future. But it's important to say that this futures-oriented approach is not about erasing the past, right? We acknowledge that both the academic disciplines, educational institutions, and urban governance institutions have created the climate crisis and created the uneven climate burden that people of color, people living in the global South, and other marginalized groups are facing. And that unless we can start to articulate what we've done wrong, we're not going to be able to move forward in a way that's equitable or productive. The climate crisis is linked to our colonial histories and imperialism, the exploitation of people and ecosystems, for example, in the Caribbean island and American territory of Puerto Rico, where one of our urban resilience to extremes UREX cities is located. And in American cities, African Americans and other people of color have been oppressed by housing, banking, landscape design, and architectural institutions. Those institutions are embedded within a hierarchical economic structure that promotes housing transactions, for example, which lead to residential displacement and housing insecurity, which is intimately connected to climate-related burdens, and disproportionately so in low-income communities and communities of color. So one of the first activities that the scenario process engages people in is articulating major events that have shaped cities, including infrastructure developments, weather events that have caused major destruction, and policies like housing discrimination that have created an uneven climate burden. What that helps to do is to situate contemporary climate vulnerabilities within the context of the past and of design decisions and exclusions that were made in the past. So co-produced scenarios and strategies are being articulated from a position of some level of wisdom about how climate inequity was produced in the past and how we might avoid replicating, reproducing that in the future, which can of course happen even in the context of new and very well-meaning policies that are intended to enhance urban resilience. So with all of that in mind, I would like to ask Elizabeth Cook and David Iwaniec to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit more about what is this scenario development process that all these cities have engaged in. And in particular, what do you think the the role, the value of scenarios is in the context of the climate crisis.
Thanks, Zoe. It's really nice to see everyone here. Thanks for joining us today. I am Elizabeth Cook. I'm an assistant professor in the environmental science department at Barnard College, and I'm an ecosystem ecologist that focuses on cities. So I use that systems perspective really to think about the future of cities and how we can make them more sustainable and resilient. And to answer your question, Zoe, about how the role of scenarios in the context of the climate crisis, I think is that the climate crisis is a really enormous challenge, and it's an overwhelming challenge. And frankly, the small tweaks that we tend to think about of how we can address them and are often what get integrated into our future plans aren't going to be enough really to address the challenge well. And what we need are some bigger changes, some more transformational changes. And so the scenario process gives us an opportunity to think outside of the box and think about what those transformational changes should look like. And so through the participatory process that we have been using in these different cities that you described, that Zoe described, we really aim to create a space for innovation to come up with better and more innovative solutions to address this challenge.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And David, I'm wondering if you could speak in particular to the kind of positive perspective. So why positive futures as opposed to some other adjective we might want to use?
Yeah, how can I think about this? When you close your eyes and you think about the cities that you live in, the cities that you know, and you think about 40, 60, 100 years into the future, what are you imagining? I want to guess if you sat and did that for a little while, there would be a lot of kind of negative challenges that you'd be thinking about, consequences of our decisions that we're making now, consequences of past decisions playing out. There might be some good aspects, some glimmers of hope, and that's what we want to focus on. The dominant discourse, whether it's in science or whether it's in literature or movies about the long-term future of our cities, is dystopian. And we want to create a space to think about, well, what are the kind of mile markers, the guides, the ambitious targets for sustainability, resilience, and equity that we should be striving toward, and what might be potential pathways, things that we should be doing now in order to on-ramp onto this new trajectory. So it's not that thinking about problems and challenges isn't important. We need to know what to avoid, but we also need to balance that with what are we striving toward.
I'm wondering if, both of you could perhaps get into the nuts and bolts of how the scenario development process has worked in these 9 cities. And in particular, why is it important to include diverse stakeholders in the participatory settings? And also, how do you really intentionally foster transformative thinking? What are the mechanisms for doing that the scenario development involves?
I can take the first part of that question at least, and I'll leave the hard one to you, David. So I would say, so the nuts and bolts are that we use a participatory process, meaning that we are bringing together many different stakeholders, whether they are community members or folks from civic organizations or non-governmental organizations or from government agencies, to come into a shared space. And in the past, we've done this in a large room where we sit around small tables and work in small groups. And currently, right now, we're planning a series of these workshops virtually. So we do it in different settings, but we bring people together and have them work in small groups to develop, work through a series of activities to develop the scenarios that David was just describing, these positive visions. And the reason that it's so important to bring all of these diverse stakeholders together is that everyone brings their own perspectives and their own expertise, and of course their own biases. And so, it's kind of like the saying that no one knows everything, but together we know a lot. So by putting people together, giving them the space to share their ideas, and I like to describe it as kind of unraveling their assumptions while they're talking to each other, and then reforming them in a more shared collective idea of what it is we're working towards, then we really do a better job, I think, that way when we're developing that shared vision in this participatory setting of developing the innovative ideas and being able to think aspirationally about what the future ought to look like.
Yeah, so thinking about this, across these 9 cities, we're looking at over 50 different scenarios that have been co-produced with these diverse participants, thinking about sustainability, resilience, and equity. So among them, there are thousands of social, ecological, and technological strategies that are being explored. And so that, for them to think about what the implications of these are. And not all of these scenarios are necessarily equally transformative, just like not all of the solutions embedded in the scenarios are equally transformative. And we do a lot of activities that we embed into our work. They're explicitly meant to to foster transformative thinking, to build the capacity for thinking transformative. One of the kind of foundational models that we use, though, also is thinking about the different types of scenarios that we create. One of the things that we do is we create strategic scenarios. And these are kind of an initial entry point. This uses the existing goals and strategies that they have. These are extracted from their resilience plans, their comprehensive development plans, their climate action plans, for example. We extract those and we look at the long-term implications of those. We can then ask the question of, well, is this enough? Is this the sustainable, resilient, equitable future that you want for your city, that your city deserves? If not, then what are the big challenges that your city is facing? Is the next question we ask. And we address this through scenarios which we call adaptive scenarios. So these adaptive scenarios are scenarios that address specific problems and challenges, the big challenges that are being faced in each of our cities. Even then, though, have we created the space for really thinking about kind of transformative, changing, kind of radical departures of the status quo for what does it mean to be a city? And in that case, then we do this third type of scenarios, these transformative scenarios, where now we've opened up the space. We've addressed and thought about and acknowledged the existing work cities have been doing. We then open up the space for thinking about what are the biggest challenges. And that then allows us to think really big and broad and aspirational about what these futures might entail.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Please.
I think that one way that and that's a great response, David, thank you. But just one other thing that I think helps to add to the fostering of transformational thinking is the participatory space. And it's really actually just giving people room to think about the long-term future and think about what it is they want to see outside of their current kind of time frame that they're typically making decisions in, or the thing that's most pressing on their mind that they're trying to respond to. And I find that in itself is a really important tool for building capacity to think about the long-term transformational changes that we're talking about.
Yeah, I wonder too if either of you want to say anything about the different types of activities that are involved in building toward those 3 different types of scenarios that David mentioned. I mean, one that's on my mind as, just an especially creative, playful kind of activity that gives people this special kind of space to think, as you were describing, Elizabeth, is the actor narrative scenario, right? Which is sort of not purely imaginative, but it's largely imaginative. I wonder if either of you would be interested in describing in a little more detail, what the role of those different types of activities are in creating the various kinds of scenarios, and especially what you consider to be transformative scenarios.
There are probably too many different activities to list. I guess that's why we put together a book, why we felt like we had to put together a book, and a typical shorter manuscript wasn't really fit. So there are a suite of more formal analytical approaches, things like systems mapping. So in this case, what we're doing is we take the strategies, the different social, ecological, technological strategies that they're thinking about, maybe for water conservation, for example, or for planting more trees, for example. And we think about the interactions and relationships among these different strategies, which ones are synergistic, which ones have potential trade-offs, to make sure that we are not just kind of overlooking them, that we're actually critically reflecting on what these futures look like. Number of activities that we focus on doing things like, well, what are the governance, we call them governance activities, to think about, well, what are the governance structures that need to exist in order to support some of these more transformative strategies that you've thought about, because existing governance wouldn't work. How might power dynamics need to change and shift in the city? Really getting the details of what that looks like. Participatory mapping. So we're thinking about spatially where these are occurring, where these different strategies, so that there we're explicitly more talking about not just where, but for whom are these strategies being thought of for? My favorite is the pathways activities. And this is actually a series of multiple activities where we're temporally sequencing the different strategies, where we're thinking about which ones of these need to come first. How do we initiate them? What are the key leverage points, the places that are really going to be kind of important to make these transformative processes possible? The creative ones are a favorite of mine also, to make sure that we have that space to think creatively, whether we're trying to embedding designers within the scenario tables so that they're visualizing what these futures, working with the participants to visualize what these futures might look like. The narratives, I agree. Zoe, that's another favorite of mine, where they're telling stories about what these futures might entail. They're creative, but they're also important pieces of, these are all different facets of the scenario process. They all represent the scenarios in different ways. They each have different strengths and weaknesses. It's amazing how many of those kind of systems relationships come out in those actor-oriented narratives and those stories, those day-in-the-life stories that people tell about these futures that don't show up on in a formal systems mapping activity. It's incredible how important they are.
Thanks to you both for that rich description. So I want to turn to Marta and Timon and ask you, what happens once these scenarios are created? What is the next sort of analytic step in the process of getting to the point where something can be like fed back to the people who participated in that setting? So Timon, starting with you, can you talk about how these scenarios are translated into models and data visualizations, and how communities are using those tools for transformation?
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. The first thing I want to say, though, is I love working with this team. I think it's just been an incredible privilege to be able to work with all of you for so many years. It's really some of the greatest colleagues anyone can ask for. So it's really cool for us to have gotten to this point where we've done all of this work and be able to really package it together and hopefully share it so it can be more widely impactful. One of the things that Elizabeth and David have done a lot of work with Marta, Nancy, and Leilani and a whole huge team to lead out is the scenario work that has resulted in actual future scenarios. And so I just wanted to sort of mention a few of those, and then we can talk about how they're translated and get to your question, Zoe. For example, ideas that have been pulled together through all of these exercises that have developed strategies that resulted in a scenario around flood resilience in San Juan. That resulted in a different scenario that's really thinking about what the connected city could look like. And that has all sorts of dimensions about changing mobility patterns, about densification and bringing communities closer together. And maybe the thing we haven't said explicitly enough yet is we're really thinking long term, right? None of these things can happen next year or even in 5 years, but the creative space we've been trying to open up through this process is to think about when our kids are older and having their own children, in whether it's 2050 or 2080 or 2100, what kind of imagined futures can we have then? And so I've been just kind of blown away by the diversity of the kinds of actual scenarios that have come up from the diverse stakeholders, right? We're not top down saying we have to have one that is about energy security. These are things that sort of arise. And so once those are articulated, and of course they're articulated in lots of ways, they're articulated on maps, on timelines, through some of these activities that David and Elizabeth were talking about, we also want to compare and contrast them. So I'm going to actually show a couple visuals briefly here about what this kind of looks like. And if you'll just bear with me while I make a quick transition, the visions that are articulated here in the center, we have an example of visions of Baltimore, ultimately produce a suite of different actual future scenarios, right? These visions are then bundled into things like a coastal resiliency scenario, or a green city scenario, or a connected city scenario, an energy and food security scenario. There's a whole suite of these scenarios. This is what David was talking about, and over 50 of these scenarios have been produced. But we also want to ask, so how are they different? How will the strategies that are developed there actually perform when we think about the future climate change types of events that may happen in those spaces? So one of the things we've done is build a modeling environment where we can translate those visions into a spatial model, and out of that spatial model, then we can compare and contrast them in a quantitative way. And so Marta is going to talk about how we also compare and contrast them in a more qualitative way. But one of the things we've done, and I'll just show you an example of this in Baltimore, is model out that future from a land use land cover perspective. And for folks who don't just get super excited about land use and land cover maps, this can look extremely boring. It's like, it's another map of urban densification and where the green space is. But there's something really critically important here, which is to try to understand how the fundamental structure of the city will change under a current vision, right? Whether that vision is a vision about increasing the density for lots of sustainability reasons, or whether that's about really trying to bring more nature into the city. So here you're looking at an example from a scenario focused around resilience to heat on the left, and a scenario focused around resilience to coastal flooding on the right in the region of Baltimore and Central Maryland. And the reason we do this is, one, so we can try to understand and compare and contrast how those different scenarios result in different land use and land covers. On its own, that can be very interesting, but it also allows us to do other things, right? It means once you have that, you can plug that into other modeling environments, and you can, for example, say, and this is a simulation to try to understand where flooding might happen in the future based on these different scenarios. So we can ask a question of all those scenarios, whether it's about connectivity and mobility, whether it's about food and energy security, whether it's about coastal flood protection or heat resiliency, how all of them might perform when we simulate an extreme rainfall event, for example, or how any of these might change if, in this case, we simulate future heat and try to understand which one of those scenarios is going to result in a hotter city. Presumably the one that's focused on heat resiliency will be the coolest one because they've intentionally really thought about that. But it may also be that some of the other ideas have similar kinds of benefits, but we want to be able to compare and contrast these. So this is essentially what we've been doing in a quantitative way, is really to bring these in a model environment so we can ask some of these questions. And then additionally, we've also been thinking about how we can make these useful in a visual setting. So if it's okay, I'm going to just demonstrate for maybe 2 minutes what, and in the chapters in the book, you can see more of this work, some of the modeling work that's led by Luis Ortiz and others in our lab, and by Ahmed Mustafa and Rocio Carrero in the lab. And then here, led by Daniel Sauter and Claudia Tomateo, we've also done things like, if we go from Baltimore to San Juan, where we build a data viz platform that allows us to zoom into these areas, to layer in the current status of the city. Here, I'm showing you the total population in and around San Juan, Puerto Rico. But it also means we and you guys can all play around with this if you go to urx.urbansystemslab.com, we can turn on various aspects of the city, but then we've also brought these scenarios, the modeled scenarios from all those visions, into that future context. And we can really start to look at what they might look like in a particular neighborhood. So these are neighborhoods in San Juan, Puerto Rico, for example. And we can compare and contrast. How does the food in this case, and you can see in the bottom left of the screen here, the food and energy security scenario differ from the flood resilience scenario in terms of the way in which it's going to change the fundamental nature of the landscape, which is very intentional from the participants, right? This is exactly the kinds of things that they wanted to do. And how does that differ from the connected city scenario? And so these are spaces where we can really dig into the city and try to start exploring and understanding what these visions might ultimately really mean in the future. And so I'm going to stop there unless anybody wants to talk further about that. But I think this is just giving you an example of the way in which we can do so many things with these visions. Once people are able and given the opportunity to really articulate what is the future that they want, then we can ask a number of questions of those, and bringing them into a quantitative environment is really helpful. And it requires lots of brilliant people who hopefully have called out a few of them here that Need mentioned.
Thanks so much, Timon. Marta, can you share with us how you approach the question of analyzing the scenarios, comparing, et cetera, from a more qualitative perspective, and what types of understandings does that bring forward? In particular, how does that enable like a different kind of perhaps reflectivity that the more quantitative data viz approaches that Timon shared with us might not be able to get at?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I'll just say briefly, my name is Marta Berbés, and I'm an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. And so I'm calling from the ancestral lands of the Akimel, O'odham, and Peebush Indigenous Nations, also known as Phoenix. I also just want to acknowledge, I see a bunch of co-authors and co-conspirators. So thanks for making the time. In terms of the question of how do we assess things in a qualitative way, so we created this tool that we call the RESCUE, which is the Resilience, Equity, and Sustainability Qualitative Assessment. And we started to do this assessment as a complement to the modeling that Timon's team has been leading. And so one of the reasons for doing this is to be able to capture certain dimensions of the future visions that will not be reflected on the maps that the models typically produce, because they really lack a biophysical expression. So for instance, if you think of equity, you can see spatial and distributional aspects, say of like the distribution of green space in a city that can be captured in a map, but procedural aspects of equity, recognitional aspects of equity, those will be missing. But so we wanted to find a way of capturing those dimensions because we thought that they were important. So to do this, what we did is we identified a set of principles. I believe there's now 45 principles from the literature. And through our assessment, we look at the extent to which those mechanisms are present or absent in the visions that the stakeholders articulated. So like if I could just share my screen, or whoever has the slide deck could share the screen, I'll just show you very briefly what the assessments look like once they're done. Yes, so this is the assessment for Phoenix. So it doesn't really matter. These are just like 5 scenarios that we did in Phoenix, and this is the resilience part of the assessment. So we typically create these flower diagrams where you see that some aspects, some mechanisms that we know enhance resilience are represented, and they're talked about in that vision, and maybe some other aspects are not present in that vision. And what we typically do is that we bring this back to the city and we show them with the idea of fostering and prompting more conversation around the things that they are clearly thinking about, but also the things that are not touched on that vision, and why is that? And maybe we need to create we need to tend to other aspects, and so the idea is to help them these help the conversation on things that they hadn't considered before. In terms of like influencing policies or decision making, I think that I would love for this to be a stepping stone towards creating metrics for resilience and equity and sustainability for each of our cities. I think we were a bit shy in terms of creating a set of indicators that are indicators of resilience and equity and sustainability out there. But we were very aware that we were talking about future visions. So we didn't want to be that prescriptive. And we were talking about very different contexts, and we're also talking about the year 2080. So I think that the indicator approach didn't seem suitable for us, but clearly I think that this could be a stepping stone, and I would love to sort of like continue that work and trying to figure out what would it mean to have measurable metrics that reflect some of this in each of the local contexts of our cities.
And Marta, I know that part of your background is in political ecology, and I'm wondering if you might be able to just speak briefly to, like, how does the political ecology perspective influence the way that you think about scenarios and anything else about this project?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and I want to acknowledge many conversations that I've had with Katinka Weissman, with Matt Fagan, who were also part of the UREX, and the many conversations we have had about the role of scenarios and futurity. But I think in essence, when we have a more critical perspective to scenarios, for me, it helps me to think about two things. One is it makes me really aware of who is not in the room. So that is, it makes me think about those like whose visions, whose desires for a better world are not being realized or even talked about. And I think that this is particularly relevant when it comes to climate visions, because the people who are most vulnerable to extreme events, might not be the same people who are in the room. So in my case, it really has prompted me to seek out ways of creating scenarios and developing anticipatory and foresight tools with marginalized collectives. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the question period. The other way in which I think a critical lens informs scenarios, it kind of underscores the need for radical thinking. What I mean by this is that, certainly in our workshops, there are many ideas, there are many, no doubt interesting different ideas, but it kind of prompts me to think, like, if we are questioning the interlocking systems of privilege upon which we rest. And so to me, it's almost like a call for the radical imagination. And personally, I think it's also humbling, and kind of like moves me to sort of like step aside and try to listen to those who have been saying these things all along. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Marta. So I think we're almost ready to go into the question and answer period, so we can start to hear from all of these participants who are on the Zoom call. But before that, I want to just pose a couple of questions to the entire group. And we can, anyone can just jump in to answer. So a central argument of the book is that a positive futures approach really reconceptualizes the meaning of urban systems in some way. But we're all coming from different disciplinary perspectives and different types of expertise. So I kind of want to hear, like, what does that mean to everyone? How do you understand the ways in which positive futures oriented co-production expands or even transforms the way that we understand cities? And anyone is welcome to jump in.
You're gonna have to call on us like school kids.
No, I would say, like, so I'll just start it because they're all shy. But I'll just say that I think the exercise of imagining it's important. And the exercise, because if we don't do it, others will do it. And so I think that for me, like the idea of thinking of what, not what is or what can be, but what should be, is an important exercise. So I think like it's this idea of like we need to reimagine, and through that you sort of like question what the present situation is and what led you to it.
I had a hard time thinking about your question, Zoe, because I think about this work and it's so context dependent in each of our cities. It has a lot to do with starting place. It has a lot to do with kind of what capacities do they have already, and even what capacities they acknowledge or recognize as something that they want to develop and build. In some of our cities, the planning work is a lot more technocratic and building the capacity for participatory, building the capacity for them to engage in participatory settings like this was crucial. In other cities, there was a lot of value from thinking critically about not just the social, ecological, technological system in terms of what are the different components, but really being, enabling, building the capacity to think about what are the potential interactions and trade-offs and synergies among these things, to think about them in terms of pathways. In other cities, there's a lot more focus on governance and how might governance need to change in order to enable, even to allow for some of these visions to flourish. So in each of our cities, it really is a different answer, I feel like. Depending on where they're at and what they're looking for.
I think we should spend a minute also kind of reflecting critically on, maybe the things that didn't happen. I think like Marta has already alluded to some of that, right? This, what was there enough sort of critical thinking about who was in the room and what it might take to get like a more diverse participatory setting, but maybe what are some other things that, if you were advising people who are reading this book and thinking about replicating some of the co-production practices, what would you advise them given, what you might do differently if you were to like replicate this process in the future?
Well, I can start us off, and mostly I'm just going to second what Marta has already said. I think it's a really important point, and it's been made in the chat as well. Thank you. That who you're talking to is certainly going to influence the type of visions that you develop. And it's important to think about when you develop a positive vision, who is it positive for? And it's not going to be positive for everyone, most likely. And so that, bringing even more people into the conversation, and for the most part, we've done this work so far with more formal institutions, whether they're civic organizations or government agencies, and we haven't had as much opportunity to work with community partners as Marta mentioned. And so I think that is a really important thing that way we could expand this work and expand the dialogue that we're having and thinking about the future.
Do you mind if I interject again? I know I just spoke, but it's a really pressing thing. And that is, we don't want to create scenarios that just sit on a shelf. It's amazing to watch the discourse around the future of the city blossom. But what's that next step? Visions alone aren't enough. And so how do we take these visions and think about the transitions and implementation? Building into the project the research to actually create this change, to actually build these capacities within our different cities. How do we on-ramp onto these new trajectories that they have envisioned? How can we support that process and study these dynamics of transformations that are going on? This is something that I think we regretted we didn't build in from the onset, but something that we're just now starting and is kind of newly emerging on the horizon, because we realize that that's a crucial aspect that we weren't focusing on when we originally envisioned this project, submitted the proposal type thing.
Maybe one more thing to add to that, unless somebody else wants to speak up, is I have lots of ideas about what we can do differently, obviously, but all in the spirit of doing even better job. So one other thing I think, and this partly addresses a question that was in the chat earlier, and just so it doesn't get missed by Gina, of how do we engage with local governments and how much do they integrate it into their planning process? And so we do that, and we work really hard at it, and we have local partners in each of the cities that we work in. But as you can imagine, when you're working in 9 or 10 cities, even though we have an amazing and very dedicated team in lots of the cities that we're working in, almost all the cities we're working in, it's a challenge to really develop those strong collaborative working relationships with our local partners and make sure that we're integrating them as soon as possible into the process. And so I think, and we're working on this now in kind of a second iteration of this project and kind of ongoing work that we're doing now, where we are working really closely with fewer cities. And I think that helps us to do a better job of being collaborative partners in the process.
So I think we can continue to, talk about if there are questions about like where this work is going, how is it being continued, how is it evolving over the next several years, and the kinds of projects that have come out of it. We can continue to talk about that maybe in the Q&A, but I know there are like a number of questions in the chat and maybe others who want to jump in. So I'll pass it off to Chris to moderate our question and answer period.
Great, thanks, Zoe. This has been amazing. Thanks so much for sharing out to all our speakers. We had a few questions earlier in the chat that maybe I'll just try to highlight, and I think some of you touched on this, but maybe you want to reinforce what you were saying. From Valeria, she's asking about how can we actually improve multidisciplinary and intersectorial approaches to really make urban system governments really effective, right, to have impact. And her question, I think, is pointing to policy. What's the role of policy here? Maybe I want to take that on a little bit.
The question is, what is the role of policy in creating intersectoral governance? Is that the question?
Yeah, so how can we improve a multidisciplinary and intersectorial way to make really effective the urban systems governments, and how to develop policies which have results and actual sustainable impact?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that some of the idea behind these new offices of sustainability and now like resilience that we're seeing is that there are people who are actually responsible for holding the activity of being translational across the different sectors, right? To translate it across the different jargons and languages and practices. So I think that that's a really exciting development. I also think that we need approaches for articulating values and learning from each other. So that's part of the co-production process, is to like articulate, develop a kind of empathy, right, for where people are coming from, like what are the different goals of different types of managers and practice across different sectors, and develop co-learning strategies based on a variety of diversity of values. I think, Elizabeth, you wanted to answer this question as well.
I was going to make a really similar point that the developing the shared empathy and the shared kind of language to talk across different sectors, I think allows that collaboration to happen more freely and more strongly when the plans are being developed. And hopefully through the workshop process, through the participatory process, we create space for those connections to be made and to develop into stronger connections that can continue in the future.
I think just to add a slightly different point to it, it's also really challenging to do, right? So what Zoe and Elizabeth are just describing, I think, is absolutely on point, right? These are the ways in which we can create a space and encourage that. but to really think systemically about solutions in a way that we can see how they're going to work from multiple perspectives, understand how they may not work in some places, and then they're going to have to be adjusted, is something I think we're all still learning how to do. Anyone in a seat of decision making has got to learn how to do that. So we are trying to create a space to encourage that and create a way to share languages and to, you know, create a place where we can respect each other and learn from each other. But I also think this is just a long-term difficult challenge to really try to understand the tight interconnections of how everyday activities, let alone policies that may last a long time or legislation that may be put into place, will have impacts across the urban system, right? It'll have impacts on infrastructure, it'll have impacts on people's everyday lives, it'll have impacts on our ecosystems. And that's hard to hold in your head all at once, that complexity. And so I think we're all working on trying to figure that out and create a space where we can have a conversation and try to understand it a little bit better than we have before.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a particular activity in one of the governance activities when they were describing, you know, what are these new governance structures that need to exist? What are the new policies that need to exist? What policies do we need to get rid of even to enable this? You know, and so imagine this, you know, you're sitting around a table and there may be a community leader, a director from a nonprofit, associate director from planning department or from neighborhood services, or, you know, just these various groups around a table. And I remember this one time, they were describing a new partnership that needs to exist. I don't remember if it was between departments or between a community organization and a nonprofit, but I remember they were describing this new relationship, this new institution needs to exist. And they looked over each other immediately and said, wait, why aren't we doing this now? You know, it was just kind of like a beautiful aha moment that they had. And where they realized that these new institutions that they're describing to enable these futures are things that are within their grasp, within their abilities to create even, you know, immediately.
That's great, David. I think it sort of gets to a question we had from Elaine about how to sort of tailor conversations based on the communities you're working with. I wonder if anybody wants to touch on maybe like a city or an instance that, you know, similar to what David was talking about, where something kind of became clear that wasn't so much so like a best practice or some sort of surprise or a challenge was overcome. If there's a city in particular that maybe stands out.
Well, I don't know if I have like very concise examples because I think like they are ongoing, but I think that in terms of like those conversations, like how do they happen on the ground with communities? Like I think that there's a long tradition in participatory action research about how do you approach communities, and I think that this works in a longer timeline. So sometimes this is a slower, maybe more uncertain process that really, you know, centers how whatever that need for that particular community is. So like for here, for instance, in Phoenix, I started, you know, sort of just attending events and finding, you know, like people, organizers, NGOs that we're hosting or we're trying to do something. And so it's kind of like the way in which you insert yourself in that conversation. Like I'm not creating the conversation, but the conversation is happening. And so like you're starting to sort of like be part of something larger. And so like, you know, from many, like to that process of, you know, attending, talking, having coffee, like a lot of it is very soft and very sort of informal. You know, like then there's those conversations around, you know, like what do they need? How do they want to get there? And then maybe, you know, the work that I've been doing, say with in this part of the city in Phoenix, with the African American community, it did come up, you know, it was very grassroots. It was something around, they wanted to create Black-centric futures because clearly a lot of the ideas, the plans that the city puts out, that you know, maybe researchers put out, we're not necessarily speaking to that particular community. And so we sort of like eventually started like bringing more people together, and, you know, they do it. I usually just cheer them on, and a lot of, because it's not my vision clearly. So, but I think that it's like creating or being part of these spaces, in trying not to, I don't know, like, I think like, as I'm talking, I'm like, well, what is my role in this? Like, and I think it's like very gentle steer and very gentle, like supporting, and then just, you know, let those things emerge. I do think that there is a lot of originality and a lot of creativity in terms of collectives to create, like, you know, tools for thinking about the future. And it's just refreshing to see how you know, maybe we think that we're doing cutting edge stuff, but then like you can see this like on many groups that are trying to reimagine better conditions for themselves.
That's great. Thanks, Marta. And I'm sort of noting the time. A few folks had to head out. So I wonder if maybe folks want to talk about any future directions for this effort, any research interest or things that are in the pipeline. I know at the lab, we have a new board game that we're excited to launch that will hopefully be a tool to help communities come together and have conversations about this. But for our other speakers, any ideas about where this work might be headed?
Well, I'll tell you what my plans to take over the universe. So actually, I mean, I do have a lot of this like sort of like more grassroots things happening, and they've all like been like really fun. And I don't know what the next one will be, because it usually is dictated from, it comes from outside. But I am moving to the University of Waterloo, and I think that my plan is to sort of like create something similar in Canadian cities or in Canadian regions. So that's something that I envision doing.
It's worth saying that we're still working on this. So you know, it's not as if this is finished. I don't think this work is ever finished, right? It's an ongoing process, and we have some continued funding to continue this work, especially currently in New York, Atlanta, Phoenix, and San Juan. So that's just kind of an update for everyone, and the fact that those we're digging more deeply and continuing to work in those places right now. And then Marta's gonna blow up Canada on this. This is also related to some similar work among our colleagues that's happening in some other European, South African, and other contexts. And so I just kind of want to mention that if people aren't aware, the Seeds of a Good Anthropocene project does a lot of very similar co-produced visioning work that is place-based, but also has implications for the way we think about global scenarios as well. So there's a lot of really interesting work that's happening even beyond the URX network that we're connected to, and glad to be able to share this as here's what we've learned. Maybe you can use some of this, and you can also tell us what you've learned. And so there's a collaborative space that's happening all around the world that's really trying to learn from each other about, you know, what worked, what didn't, how we can do this better.
Closing thoughts, David. Yeah.
Oh, you know, I was thinking about what's next, and I was thinking about, you know, give us a couple of years, even better yet, join us and collaborate on this. I'm thinking that the next book is focusing on lessons learned in how do we enable these transformations, you know, understanding the process of transformation. What does it mean to be embedded in a transformation, you know, in a transformation dynamic? How do we enable it? What's the role of researchers? What's the role of government, of civic organizations? These are the things that we are exploring and confronted with right now. Don't have the answers to. I want to completely admit it. This is the space that we're exploring right now, though. How do we enable these positive futures now that have been articulated?
Fantastic. Well, I just want to say
And
thanks
Chris,
to our speakers.
can I share
Oh, yeah,
really
go ahead, Timon.
quickly before
Yeah.
you close off what
Yeah.
you just mentioned, which is this board game we've been developing to get across a lot of these concepts and use it as a space to engage. So my daughter likes playing this with me. We're using this in classrooms, undergraduate and graduate classrooms as well. So I just encourage people to check this out because it's another way we've been trying to think about how you can make this fun as a way to, think about your future. And in this case, you get to build it. So anyway, I'll just throw that out for people if they're kind of interested in digging more in an example of some of the other fun things that are happening with this network.
Well, thanks to our speakers, Zoe, Timon, Elizabeth, Marta, David. Gonna hand it back over to Zoe to maybe close us out. And maybe we have one more question from Nicole. Did you want to mention something, Nicole, really quick?
Hi all. Thanks for this. I am learning an awful lot. I'm really curious about the scenario of just green enough. And I understand the fear is that by reintroducing more nature and green to communities that we may displace the people who are living in those communities now. But I'm curious if that scenario was something that your participants came up with, or if it was, or if the group came up with it another way. Thanks.
So that's one of the scenarios that we did in Phoenix, and all of the scenario themes are done between the research team and then practitioners in the city. So there's a conversation to sort of figure out maybe initial interesting themes. And so like gentrification might be a theme that maybe we want to tackle. Heat might be another one, etc. And then we did a World Cafe that we opened it to folks in the community and to policymakers. And that's where like they had those conversations, and then the themes get narrowed down a little bit more. And exactly what you say, like the just green enough, what's something that is of concern, because for Phoenix, we were doing scenarios in this one particular area, which is South Phoenix, which is an underserved community. And there's a lot of fear that there's a lot of gentrification already happening. So then the scenario becomes this vehicle to explore what could it look like if we had a just green enough scenario, right? And so there was a lot of that was one of the scenarios that scored really high on all of the equity components, but also like a lot of green spaces, a lot of community garden, a lot of participation. So you could those were sort of like the mechanisms that scenario vision had. But it was kind of like a back and forth, and that's how all the themes come up. And then they get more then once you have the workshop, they actually get more. The conversation goes whatever it goes. But yeah.
Thank you.
Those themes, Nicole, I also want to mention, these are more, so these get co-produced by the researchers and practitioners together, but they're more of an entry point rather than centering on. So for example, there might be a flood scenario where the entry point is talking about flood, where they talk about gentrification just as much as a scenario where the entry point was thinking about gentrification. They might end up talking about they will end up talking about transportation and flooding also in those scenarios. So they're not meant to constrain and restrict the conversation. They're more intended to kind of as a place to start having the conversation about the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Let's see, any other questions before we kind of wrap up here? All right, wonderful. Well, I'm going to head it back to Zoe in case you want to just close us out or say any final remarks, Zoe. But again, thanks to all our speakers for joining, and we'll make sure to share out some resources via email to everybody that attended as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say huge thanks to all the participants for being here. Get in touch with us if you want to collaborate. I saw a message in the chat about collaboration, and we'd love to hear from others who think this might be useful in the community that you're working in. And as everyone mentioned, this project is moving forward in a lot of different forms. So please do get in touch with us. Download the volume. It's free. Share it with your students. Use it for teaching material if you find it useful. Contact us if you have any questions. And happy Climate Week.
Amazing. Thank you
Thanks,
so much,
everyone.
Zoe.
Thanks everyone for being here. It's
Okay.
great to get a chance to talk to you all.
Yes.
Take care.